Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to turn you on to great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, and just things that are off the beaten path that you wouldn't normally know anything about. And we're going to do another Bible decode today from the New Testament and from the work of Michael Menescotz, Menesgotz, who has a new book out that's called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. And Menescotz is one of many scholars out there who have written on the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, that the New Testament, in whole or in part, was written by the Caesars, the Roman Caesars in particular, those of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars who ruled Rome from 69 to 96 AD. And that includes Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian. And they wrote, according to the theory, they wrote the New Testament in order to basically chill out, mellow out, prune, tame, domesticate the Jews. They were sick and tired of these militant Jews constantly revolting and uprising and revoluting and rioting and terrorizing the Roman order of their empire. There were hundreds of nations under the Roman Empire, and the Jews were the most difficult to govern. They had this monotheistic God who called them the chosen people, so they tended to be very xenophobic and separatists. Their God was also jealous and zealous, didn't like to compete with other gods that the Romans, that was kind of what the Romans did. They tried to absorb all gods into their pantheon. And the monotheistic God was also obsessive compulsive and demanded many different kinds of rituals that had to be followed to the letter. Strictures against graven images, circumcision, kosher food laws, animal sacrifice laws. And the Jews were prepared to die to uphold these rituals, as the Romans found out to their dismay. The Romans didn't have a problem killing the Jews, but they just didn't always have the resources to devote to how many Jews they had to kill. And the Romans also were aware that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah. They were waiting for a military Messiah, one that was going to come and help them rise up and defeat the Romans after over 100 years of rule under Rome in Judea. And in 66 AD, that was kind of fulfilled. The Messiah, at least 3 candidates for the Jewish Messiahship came to the fore at this point in this revolt in Jerusalem that kicked out the Herod puppet kings of Judea. They were puppets of the Romans. And this was led by Eleazar, Simon, and John. And this led to a 7-year-long war between the Jews and the Romans. Emperor Nero, after the revolt started, sent in General Vespasian to put down the revolt. He was there for 3+ years, and then he became the new emperor. during the end of the Roman Civil War, and he appointed his son Titus to be the new general there in Judea, and he was there for 3+ years, all putting down this Jewish rebellion. So after the war was over, they were kind of like, both of them were wounded in the war, Vespasian and Titus. And they got back to Rome. All the Herods were already there. And they were just like, screw these Jews. We got to do something about these Jews before we have another war with them. And so the Romans went into their bag of tricks, which always includes psychological operations. They also loved to do puns and riddles and games and enigmas and word plays and typologies. And so they wrote up a story of a Jewish Messiah who instead was a Prince of Peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, turning the other cheek to oppression, walking an extra mile with the soldier's pack, begging his God to forgive the Romans, for they know not what they do. And at the same time, would go outside the Jewish temple and overturn the tables of the Jewish money changers, changing out Roman graven images money for Jewish kosher money that could be brought inside the temple for offering, and disrupting the business of the Jews who were selling pigeons and doves for the animal sacrifice rituals inside the temple. So here again, Jesus is taking a direct hit on the Jewish rituals, while at the same time being deferential to Rome. And if you go beyond the Gospels and you look at the Paul material, the Pauline material, it's even more pronounced in Paul. He is even more deferential to the Romans and even more destructive to the Jewish rituals, to the point where Voskillen and Sheldon have written a book called Operation Messiah that pins Paul as a Roman agent, a spy, a secret agent of Rome, because he was, killing, followers of Jesus. And then all of a sudden, he has an epiphany on the road to Damascus, and somehow his men that he's with don't do anything, and he just switches over to the other side, and nothing happens to him. And then he just starts being a tireless advocate for Jesus. They contend that he was a spy the whole time, which I would contend that too, except that I think that the Roman origins hypothesis actually makes more sense than that as well. But just the point is that, you can see the Roman origins of both of these things, because just from the fruit, they are pro-Roman and anti-Jew, and they extol the virtues of being peaceful and not revolting, being good citizens. That's what the Romans wanted. They wanted you to be a good citizen, a law-abiding citizen. Okay. Now, so what Vespasian and Titus did is that they wrote a story of this Jewish Messiah, and they backdated it by 40 years making Jesus's ministry from 30 to 33 AD. And then they sponsored a history of this war that they just got done fighting in. And that was called War of the Jews. And that was written by a person or people named Josephus. And according to Josephus's autobiography, he was a member, an adopted member of the Flavian dynasty. He was adopted by Vespasian. He lived at Caesar's palace in a townhouse and was one of the court historians for the Romans. And his book, his 7-volume work, War of the Jews, was given enthusiastic endorsement by Titus. And he lived there for, I think, the rest of his life, wrote another magnum opus called Antiquities of the Jews 20 years later, so he was still there then. So, and he is known as Flavius Josephus. And Christians actually used Josephus's name as corroboration for the existence of Jesus without actually realizing that, without actually reading Josephus. Because when you read Josephus, then you realize that he is actually powerful evidence against the existence of Jesus. Just because he cites his name, but when you look at the parallels between War of the Jews and the Gospels, you will recognize that they were written by the same people at the same time for the same reason. They parallel each other, they bounce off each other, they mirror each other, they mock each other, they parody each other. They are in conversation with each other, and they are intended to be read together. One example, there are many different themes of parallels. One example, the clearest example is that Jesus has a 3-year ministry in Judea from 30 to 33 AD. Titus has a 3-year military campaign in Judea from 70 to 73 AD. War of the Jews documents all of Titus's military campaign, the places he goes, the battles he fights, the difficulties and triumphs that occur. And turns out that Jesus mirrors the military campaign of Titus. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus goes, in the same order. And wherever they go, they engage in parallel adventures or circumstances. Whatever happens to Titus, it happens in a parallel, a conceptually parallel, typologically parallel event happens to Jesus. Also, and they are offset by exactly 40 years. So sometimes to the very hour, the events happen with a difference of 40 years. And the 40 years also comes into play. Many of the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament are fulfilled literally in the pages of War of the Jews. And many of them are fulfilled by Titus, which I'm not the first to mention that makes him makes Titus the second coming of Jesus. But there are many other themes of parallels, and that's what Michael Menescotts does in his book, is he goes into the book of Luke and finds the parallels from Jewish war and found over 250 parallels just in the book of Luke. And he documents them here in this book, and we're going over them one at a time. Many of the parallels are kind of weak, and they are parallel, but they could easily be coincidental. But then when there are dozens and dozens of others that are doing the same thing, then you start to recognize that they are intentional. But then there are many other parallels that are powerful, well hidden, well thought through, and sometimes even brilliant genius, albeit evil genius. The Romans are mean-spirited, mocking and ridiculing of the Jews or whoever is believing in the story of Jesus. They are laughing at you for believing in the story. Joseph Atwill, author of Caesar's Messiah and Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, which are two books on this same subject, groundbreaking books, calls the New Testament an intelligence test, the world's first intelligence test. And if you fail the test, you end up believing in a false God. I would just say false Messiah. I don't think that this really is about God. This is about Jesus, and it's about the Bible. So Menescott finds these 250 plus parallels, and then he also charts them on a graph. He puts the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. He plots all 250 parallel points, 250 plus, and they make 5 near perfect letters in Latin. Latin being the language of the Romans, the Caesars. Most people in Rome spoke Greek. The elites spoke Latin and wrote in Latin. The New Testament is originally in Greek as well, which should be a red flag right off the bat. Other red flags are that the Romans had a monopoly on censorship. Nothing was going to be published in the Roman Empire unless Caesar approved of it. The Romans had a monopoly on publishing. They are the only people within the empire that had thousands of slaves who spent their whole day copying texts. And the Romans also had a monopoly on distribution. They had the only postal service in the Roman Empire to get the propaganda out there. So without the agency of Rome, the New Testament as we know it would not have been able to have been passed around. Okay, now let's look at some of these parallels. Now the parallels, also the 5 letters in Latin are APTVS, Arius Piso Titus Vespasianus, or possibly Aegion Numa Titus Vespasianus. But the TVS is Titus Vespasianus, which they also used on coins. That inscription from that same period. So it's not just a made-up set of letters. And it also basically means that the Romans not only wrote the book of Luke, but they signed their name to it. And so you can ignore all this evidence at your peril. So we're going to go over some of these parallels. These are parallels that are from the A and the P, meaning at the very beginning of War of the Jews, which is kind of introductory material, and Menescott suggests that it was probably written later by a later emperor, perhaps Domitian, because the parallels are not nearly as strong, and the letter development is not nearly as strong either. But some of them are relatively interesting, it seems like. This one is from Jewish War 181, Book 1, Chapter 27, Paragraph 3. So Herod asked everyone's sentence, and the first to give sentence was Saturninus, a reference to the Roman god Saturn, often seen as having 3 sons, and who's also used in Shakespeare, and used to great effect here in this Jewish war as another signature that Joseph Atwill gets into. But that is a different subject. So, okay, Saturninus, who condemned the young men, but not to death, for it was not fit for him, who had 3 sons, to vote for the destruction of the sons of another. Meaning he gave sentence on a son, but refused to sentence him to death. And this is matched up with Luke 23:24. Pilate gave sentence on Jesus, the Son of God, but refused to sentence him to death, handing him to the Jews. So above we have a parallel with Pilate sentencing the Son, but refusing to sentence him to death, in which the apparent allusion to the Saturn and his 3 sons is not clear to me, but certainly is taking the opportunity to introduce a Roman god into the story. Not quite sure what he's getting at there. Just flip the page and try out another parallel. This one is coming from Jewish War 250, Book 2, Chapter 8, Paragraph 1. During this administration, a certain Galilean called Judas prevailed with his countrymen to revolt and said they were cowards if they would pay a tax to the Romans, and after God submit to mortals as their lords. And this is matched up with Luke 22:48. Judas betrayed Jesus by receiving money from the Romans. So one is refusing to give money to the Romans, and one is receiving money from the Romans. Don't know about that one. In the parallel above, Jewish War presents a betrayer called Judas. Oh, I guess they're both named Judas. Okay, that's better. In the parallel above, Jewish War presents a betrayer called Judas, which will be familiar from Jesus' story. For anyone wishing to dismiss the idea that there is an intentional link here, this Judas the Galilean also gets referenced in the book of Acts, which has caused some people to speculate on whether Jesus Christ's story might be based on him. So this character, Judas the Galilean, lived, I think, in the early 1st century. I thought he was executed in like 6 AD or something like that. Anyway, don't quote me on that. This is Jewish War 164, Book 1, Chapter 25, Paragraph 5. Herod's wife, Mary, had a sister that Herod promised in marriage to Pheroras, and on her death he then promised Miriam's daughter instead. But he didn't consummate the marriage with Mary's relative because he loved his maidservant. So Herod gave her instead to another man, who was her cousin and Herod's nephew. In summary, Mary's daughter was involved with Mary's relative's husband, who was an adulterer who didn't consummate marriage with her, so she ended up with her cousin. the Herods were into marrying their cousins a lot. Well, the Jews in general, but especially the Herods. Okay, this is matched up with Luke 2:4. When Joseph took Mary to be taxed, she had already become pregnant at Zechariah's house. And he does here in this book somewhere imply that Zacharias is the father of Jesus. Mary goes to the house and leaves 4 months later, or 3 months later, she's pregnant. He goes through that in a different section. So he says, Vespasian, the father of Titus, not sure what he's talking about there. Let's try this again. When Joseph took Mary to be taxed, she had already become pregnant at Zechariah's house, staying there with her cousin Elizabeth, Mary's relative. Joseph knew it wasn't his own child, but did not wish to make a public example of her. Josephus was espoused to a Mary, but not married, so could not consummate marriage. Josephus, I don't know where he's going with that. He seems to be kind of that, maybe that's a big set of typos, because he's got a lot of stuff in here from Vespasian and Titus and Josephus, but this is all supposed to be coming from Luke. So he says, in summary, Mary was with her cousin and gets involved with Mary's relative's husband, who was implicitly therefore an adulterer. And she ended up with a different man who did not consummate marriage with her. So that's pretty much the same story. The other one is Mary's daughter was involved with Mary's relative's husband, who was an adulterer who didn't consummate marriage with her, and so she ended up with her cousin. To understand the parallel above, recall how the nativity story presents Mary getting pregnant at the house of her cousin, with Joseph accepting her infidelity and being willing to marry her while pregnant. This is paralleled in Jewish war by Mary's daughter engaging in similar infidelity and adultery that similarly involves a cousin. Given that the final stage of the secrecy cult was to reveal to the worthy initiates that it was all a big joke designed to convert commoners to righteousness, this meant that the author had a reason to construct some of the parallels as almost juvenile jokes. That's part of his thesis, Christianity's origins as a Flavian secrecy cult. The Flavian secrecy cult, he hypothesizes, has 4 different levels. The first one is, you begin to recognize Jesus as a hero, and then the second is you recognize Jesus as the Messiah. The third is that you recognize Jesus as the Messiah, but Titus as the second coming of Jesus, and so a greater Messiah. And then you are told that the story of Jesus is a fiction. And so now you are into what he calls pure emperor worship. I don't think he really needs that thesis for this book, but and I think it kind of distracts from the main points to me, which are that just the abundance of parallels and the fact that they fit the APTVS pattern that you can see on the thumbnail for this video. Okay, let's try this one here. Jewish War 166, Book 1, Paragraph 24, Chapter 24, Paragraph 7. There were 3 eunuchs, one appointed as the king's butler. Another of them got his supper ready for him, and the third put him to bed. The king, that is. The eunuch was, okay. the third put him into bed and lay down by him to be used obscenely. And they confessed to the intercourse. They were rebuked for touching of a sexual nature, but Alexander said not to fix their hopes upon Herod, an old man, and one so shameless as to color his hair. Okay, this is matched up with both Luke 7:37 and Luke 18:15. Luke 7:37, Jesus sat down to have meat. So it's the same image of the king of the Jews eating. The first case, it's Herod. Herod is the king of the Jews. And in this case, it's Jesus. So, but still eating. Jesus sat down to have meat, and a woman in the city who was a sinner brought an alabaster box of ointment, and she wiped his feet with the hairs of her head and anointed them with the ointment. And the Pharisee said, "What manner of woman is this that touches him? For she is a sinner." He's making some reaches here that he puts in parentheses. I'm going to shake those off here, at least for right now. This is Luke 18:15. They brought him infants that he would touch them, but his disciples rebuked them. Matthew 19:13 adds more detail to this, saying that, "For there are some eunuchs born that way. Others were made eunuchs of men, and some made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake." So 3 types of eunuchs, one associated with the kingdom. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. All right. Again here, we see the author quite content to reference sexual topics, knowing that they would be revealed only to a specific audience, presumably to help force that audience to accept that Jesus' story was all big fiction. Christians are well aware of the passage in Matthew and Luke, talking of Jesus being reprimanded for his touching of children and of men becoming eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of God, and how this is followed by the phrase, "He who can receive it, let him receive it." Christians do not see it as a euphemism for gay sex, let alone promoting it, of course.